They thought he was a mistake, a quiet black student in the wrong room at the wrong university. But when he stood up and corrected the most feared professor in front of 100 witnesses, everything changed. And that was only the beginning. They had already decided he didn't belong before he said a single word, before he wrote a single number, before he even sat down. And what they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, is that this quiet hoodie-wearing black student would end up shattering everything they thought they knew about math, about merit, about themselves. It started with a mistake, but it didn't belong to him. It belonged to the professor, one of the most feared minds in mathematics, one of the untouchables. And in front of over 100 students visiting professors and a room thick with unspoken rules, he pointed it out. What happened next didn't just change that lecture. It tore open the walls of an elite institution and exposed something they had buried deep beneath their formulas and traditions. Prejudice. You're about to hear a story that will unsettle you, a story that may inspire you, but above all, a story that will force you to ask yourself, what do we really mean when we say someone is brilliant? If this is the kind of story that grips your heart and makes you want to see justice unfold in its quietest, smartest form, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us continue telling powerful, untold stories like this one. Now let's begin where everything started. It was a gray morning in Cambridge. The sky hung low like it hadn't decided whether to rain or simply press down on the people walking below it. Cobblestone paths twisted between Gothic buildings, and the chill of late autumn made students move quickly, clutching coffee and textbooks. But inside the towering mathematics building, the temperature was something else entirely. It was cold, but not from the weather, from the atmosphere. Inside the main lecture hall, over 100 students had gathered for the most feared class in the Department of Pure Mathematics Advanced Calculus, with Professor Eleanor Voss. Voss was an academic legend. Her lectures were referred to, half-jokingly, as intellectual war zones. She didn't tolerate weakness. She didn't slow down. She didn't believe in helping anyone catch up. If you couldn't keep up, you were dead weight, and she made that very clear. But today's lecture was special. Not only were students packed into every row, but in the front occupying the best seats, like a panel of judges sat professors from various departments: statistics, theoretical physics, computational modeling. They had come not to learn, but to evaluate. This was one of Voss's open lectures, an academic performance of sorts, where she would showcase her ruthless precision and classroom dominance. They weren't there for the students. They were there for the spectacle. And sitting in the middle of the lecture hall in a worn-out gray hoodie and faded jeans was a student no one had noticed before, Nathan Cole. To most, he looked out of place, too quiet, too low profile. He didn't chat with others, didn't try to impress. He simply opened his notebook where every page was filled with tight, beautiful handwriting and waited. But the professors had noticed him, not because of his math, because of his skin in the front row. Dr. Graham Fletcher, head of the statistics department, leaned back in his chair with a smug grin and whispered to the man beside him, that one middle row gray hoodie. From Atlanta. They say he's some kind of scholarship case. The other professor followed his gaze and frowned slightly. Let me guess, he muttered. Affirmative action. Fletcher snorted. Naturally. They're ticking boxes now, and just like that. Before Nathan had lifted a pen, the verdict was in. He would fail, because he wasn't supposed to be here. The lecture hall fell into a hush as the door clicked open sharply. Professor Eleanor Voss entered, like a storm held in human form. Black trench coat, silver-rimmed glasses, clipboard tucked under her arm. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her very presence pulled silence out of the air. Students straightened their spines. Laptops snapped open, notebooks flipped to fresh pages. She walked slowly to the chalkboard, scanning the room like a general surveying a battlefield. Her eyes paused momentarily, just for a fraction of a second, on Nathan Cole. She didn't smile. She didn't scowl. She simply looked at him as if weighing his entire existence in a single breath. "Do you think you belong here?" Her glance said everything. Then she turned away, and Nathan felt the chill of something he'd known since childhood, that certain looks didn't need words to carry judgment. Voss picked up the chalk and began writing. "Last week," she said, voice sharp and clipped, "we explored the limits of vector-valued functions in multivariate settings. Today we move on to Laplace transforms." Within moments, the board was filled with dense equations, so dense that even a pause could leave someone 2 pages behind. The students scrambled to keep up. Pens scratched frantically. Keys clicked in a desperate rhythm. But Nathan, he didn't write. He watched, calm still, like the numbers on the board were part of a story he already knew the ending to. Then his eyes narrowed. A line on the board, a subtle misstep, a minor mistake in the transformation sequence. Voss had introduced a coefficient too early. Most wouldn't notice it. The answer wouldn't collapse until much later. But to Nathan, it was glaring. He looked around. No one else had caught it. They were just copying. And the professors, they were nodding along, absorbed in the spectacle of Voss's intellect. Nathan closed his eyes for a moment. He could stay silent, avoid attention, but that would mean lying to himself. He raised his hand. The air seemed to shift. "Yes." Voss turned her tone flat. "There's an error," Nathan said, his voice calm. "The transform was applied too early. It throws off the integral's convergence." A silence dropped like a curtain. Every head turned. In the front row, Fletcher leaned forward, his lips twitching with excitement. "Here it comes," he whispered. Voss didn't respond immediately. She stepped back, examining the board. Then slowly she turned and extended the chalk to Nathan. "If you're so sure," she said, "why don't you fix it?" It wasn't a request. It was a challenge, a trap. Nathan stood up, walked calmly to the front, took the chalk, and in 5 precise strokes rewrote the transformation perfectly. He didn't hesitate. He didn't explain. He just stepped back and returned to his seat. The room was dead silent. Voss looked at the board for a long moment, then without a word continued the lecture. But something had shifted. She had been corrected, and not just by anyone. By the student they had all dismissed, by the one they never expected to speak, let alone be right. That day, nothing exploded. There were no loud arguments, no dramatic apologies. But behind the silence, the seeds of something were planted. Doubt, wonder, and the terrifying realization that they might have underestimated him. Now, for those of you who made it this far, ask yourself this. If you were Nathan Cole, would you have spoken up? A. Yes. The truth matters, even if no one wants to hear it. B. No. Sometimes it's smarter to stay quiet and survive. Comment your answer below A or B and tell us why. Let's see how you would have handled that moment. And remember, we're just getting started. Because what Nathan did that day, that was only his first move. After that first quiet confrontation, Nathan Cole could have disappeared. He could have chosen silence, could have withdrawn, blended back into the crowd, never raised his hand again. He could have avoided the attention he never asked for in the first place. But the truth has a way of refusing to stay buried. In the days following that moment in Professor Eleanor Voss's lecture hall, the one where Nathan rewrote her mistake in front of everyone, Cambridge's Department of Pure Mathematics couldn't stop buzzing. Not publicly, of course. On the surface, everything moved with its usual cold formality. Students filed into lectures. Professors passed each other with polite nods. But beneath it all, something had changed. They didn't speak about him by name, not yet, but he was there in the murmurs between classes, in the tension during lectures, in the unspoken comparisons as problems were handed out, and eyes darted to see whether he would raise his hand again. And he didn't disappoint, because Nathan didn't come to impress. He came to work. Professor Voss, however, was not finished with him. After that day, the complexity of her lectures increased. Subtly at first, the problems on the board grew more layered, the logical leaps between steps more abrupt. She never said it out loud, but it was clear this was a test. And not just for the class. It was a test for him. Would he keep up? Would he survive in a battlefield of symbols, sharpened to cut? To most students, it felt like Voss was raising the temperature, slowly boiling the air around them, degree by degree. But to Nathan, the change was unmistakable. He could see it in the way her eyes lingered on him, just a heartbeat longer before she erased the board. In the problems she chose ones designed to mislead, to entrap, to overwhelm. Yet he kept rising without fanfare, without arrogance. Nathan solved each challenge with an unnerving calm. He didn't ask questions. He didn't debate the professor. He simply wrote. And what he wrote was right. Not just correct, but elegant, clean, efficient, innovative in ways that made even the graduate students pause. Voss said nothing, but the silence itself began to feel louder each day. Still, it wasn't until 3 weeks after that first correction that the real confrontation arrived. The lecture hall was full as usual. The guest professors had returned, including Dr. Graham Fletcher, who had since made no secret of his disdain for Nathan's quiet rise. He now sat with arms crossed during each lecture, eyes narrowed, waiting for the inevitable fall. That day, Voss walked in holding a red-bound textbook, the kind of book no undergraduate had any business touching. Today, she announced, her voice even and cool. We'll explore the foundational structure behind functional transform systems. But instead of introducing the concept, I'd like to pose a challenge. She turned to the board and began writing. The problem unfolded line by line, an academic monster pulled from the pages of a doctoral qualifying exam. It spanned 2 full panels of the chalkboard layers of variable substitutions, parametric boundaries, and recursive differential conditions. The room stiffened. No one moved. Even the students who normally jumped at difficult problems stared at the board in silence. Voss stepped aside, turned. "Mr. Cole," she said, the room holding its breath. "If you're as familiar with elegance in mathematical reasoning as your previous work suggests, perhaps you'd like to attempt this." It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't flattery. It was something worse. It was a trap disguised as opportunity, a challenge issued not to encourage, but to humiliate. And everyone in that room, especially the front row of waiting professors, was hungry to see him fail. Nathan stood without a word. He walked slowly to the board, eyes scanning the problem. There was no change in his expression, no visible tension. He picked up the chalk and began. At first, no one breathed. Then slowly the room shifted, because what Nathan was doing didn't look like guesswork. He wasn't fumbling through methods or testing random paths. He moved with the ease of someone transcribing a melody already playing in his head. He saw the structure, the pattern, the hidden symmetry. Line by line, the impossible became comprehensible, the chaos untangled. The problem wasn't just being solved, it was being simplified. And when Nathan finally placed the chalk down and stepped back, he had done more than answer the question. He had rewritten it into something beautiful. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then, without comment, Voss turned back to the board. She studied it closely, searching for even the faintest crack. There wasn't one. It was perfect. The tension in her jaw betrayed everything her voice refused to admit. And somewhere in the back row, A student let out a slow whispered, "No way." Nathan returned to his seat, calm, unshaken. But the class wasn't calm. The myth of who was allowed to be brilliant had just been broken. That evening, as the class emptied, one student lingered behind. Her name was Isabel Tran. She had noticed Nathan before his quiet presence, the way he moved through spaces without needing to own them, but today had made something clear. He didn't just belong, he was leading. She approached him at the library that night, where he was already deep into another notebook pages filled with complex integrals and transformation pathways. "You never look surprised when you solve something," she said softly, taking a seat beside him. "I try not to be," he replied, not looking up. "You're not just good," she said. "You're fluent." He finally looked at her. "And you're not just watching," she smiled. From that moment forward, Isabel became more than an observer. She became a collaborator, not because she needed help or because he wanted to mentor, but because she challenged him, not with cynicism, but with clarity. They spent long nights in the library, not talking much, but scribbling beside one another, checking work, pushing each other's reasoning. There was no hierarchy between them, only mutual respect. And somewhere in those quiet hours, they became something the university rarely saw, two minds building towards something bigger than themselves. Meanwhile, Professor Fletcher had begun voicing his doubts more openly. In faculty meetings, he referred to Nathan as an untested anomaly. In the staff lounge, he muttered about the dangers of elevating someone before they've earned it, but no one challenged him. Not until a junior lecturer quietly asked, "What else does he have to earn?" The room fell silent because no one could answer. Even Voss, though still unwilling to praise, began changing. She didn't soften, but her challenges became more refined. She stopped underestimating him, and that shift was the greatest compliment she could give. But Nathan wasn't interested in recognition. He had grown up in a world that didn't wait for permission to be great. He wasn't trying to break the system. He was trying to solve it. The night before the midterm evaluations, Isabel found him sitting on the grass outside the old Trinity courtyard, staring up at the stars. "You ever get tired?" she asked. "Of what?" "Of being the one who always has to prove something." Nathan didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "I'm not tired of proving. I'm tired of it never being enough." She sat beside him. "Then, let's change what enough means." That was the first time he let himself believe he wasn't alone. Because even brilliance can feel like isolation when no one sees the full picture. But now, someone did. And so when the announcement came that Cambridge would be sending a representative to the International Mathematics Invitational in Zurich, and Professor Voss quietly slipped a sealed envelope into Nathan's folder, he already knew what it would say. He didn't need to open it. He had already accepted. Not for the glory, not for the applause, but because this was no longer about proving himself to them. It was about proving something to the world. That genius has never been about permission. It's about vision. And Nathan Cole was about to show them all just how far his vision could go. The letter sat on his desk for almost an hour before he opened it. Nathan Cole had recognized the seal immediately. Deep red embossed with gold ink. Cambridge University, Faculty of Mathematics. But it wasn't the seal that unsettled him. It was what he already knew was inside. He didn't need to read the words to feel the weight of the invitation. It wasn't a reward, it wasn't an honor. It was a line in the sand. When he finally slit the envelope open and pulled out the letter, the words were as expected, formal, polished, and perfectly rehearsed. "Mr. Cole, based on your recent academic performance, and by recommendation of Professor Eleanor Voss, the faculty committee has selected you to represent Cambridge University at the upcoming International Mathematics Invitational to be held at ETH, Zurich." He paused on that line. It wasn't congratulatory. It wasn't proud. It was surgical, as if someone had taken a scalpel and carefully carved him into a corner where he couldn't say no without looking afraid. But he wasn't afraid. He was tired, not physically. That was nothing new. He was tired of fighting for the right to solve problems that should have spoken for themselves, tired of justifying a seat he had already earned, tired of knowing that with every answer he got right, a room full of men like Dr. Graham Fletcher would still lean back in their chairs and say, "He's talented, but..." There was always a but. And now they were handing him a platform, ETH. Zurich, the most brutal, respected, and unforgiving academic math arena in the world. This wasn't a gesture of faith, it was a test. They were betting on the pressure to do their work for them, to break him. Nathan folded the letter, slipped it into his drawer, and turned back to his notebook. He didn't need the letter to remind him of what was coming. He had already started preparing the moment. Professor Voss's eyes paused on him, 1 second too long. He knew the look, he knew the weight, and he knew that once again it was all on him. No safety net, no mentor, no precedent. Just silence, scrutiny, and a clock that wouldn't stop ticking. Word spread quickly, as it always did at Cambridge. The idea of a second-year undergraduate representing the university at an elite global competition sent ripples through the halls, some curious, some mocking, most cynical. He's going to Zurich. There's no way this isn't some classroom lecture. This is where the best from MIT, Princeton, and Tokyo come to compete. You think he even knows what he's walking into? But Nathan didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't answer questions he had never asked anyone to care about. Instead, he slipped deeper into his process. The library became his world. At first, he claimed a quiet corner near the rear windows, surrounded by reference volumes. But as the days passed, he moved further in until he found a study booth beneath a narrow, dim skylight where time seemed to vanish. There, for 14 hours a day, he worked. He wasn't just solving equations. He was deconstructing systems. He read through decades of IMI archives, not just memorizing problems, but tracing their lineage, studying how certain questions evolved from others, how the minds behind the exams tried to trap intuition. He created his own algorithm for time management, how many seconds he could afford to spend interpreting before committing to a line of reasoning, how often to pause and reassess, how to identify false leads and design elegant shortcuts. His notebooks multiplied. He filled them with side-by-side comparisons of alternative proofs. He rewrote the same solution 3, 5, 7 times, each version cleaner than the last, until the method itself felt invisible. He trained like an athlete would. Not for brute endurance, but for something far rarer in mathematics: precision under pressure. Nathan didn't just want to solve the problems, he wanted to own them. But what he couldn't prepare for were the whispers. Not from the students, they had long since faded into background noise, but from the faculty. He'd hear them in the corridor as he passed. "He's intelligent, sure, but he hasn't been through our formal research programs. He doesn't have any publications. He's gifted, but is he seasoned?" And from Fletcher, always the same refrain: "He hasn't earned the weight of our name." But that weight had never been given to Nathan. He had carried it alone since he arrived. And he had carried heavier things before Cambridge even knew his name. One evening, as the wind howled against the narrow windows of the mathematics library, Nathan was joined by someone he hadn't seen in a while. Isabel Tran slid into the chair across from him without asking. "You're not sleeping," she said. "I don't need sleep," he replied. "Then what do you need?" He looked at her for a long moment. His hands were stained with graphite, his eyes hollowed by focus. "I need it to be fair," he said. She nodded, understanding without needing clarification. "And if it never is?" she asked. He didn't answer, Instead, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a crumpled flyer, an old printout of the IMI's past finalists. All names, all faces, all colorless, all flawless pedigrees. Cambridge, Harvard, Caltech, Moscow, State, Oxford. Nowhere in that list was there room for someone like him, and that was exactly why he was going. Isabel stayed with him that night, not to help, not to teach, just to make sure he remembered that he wasn't invisible to everyone. In the final week before the competition, something strange happened. Professor Voss sent him a sealed envelope. Inside was a stack of problems unlabeled, unloved and unspoken for. They were unlike anything he'd seen in class. He spent 2 days on the first one, not because it was impossible, but because it was deceptively simple. The kind of question designed to twist logic into knots until it begged for a shortcut. He solved them all. Not because he wanted to prove anything to her, but because he knew what the gesture meant. This was her way of saying, I can't help you, but I won't stop you. That was enough. On the day of departure, Nathan packed his bag without ceremony. No university send-off, no press release. No professor shaking his hand with a smile and saying, "Bring us pride." He didn't need their pride. He had already decided whose voice mattered. As he zipped his coat and stepped out into the cold morning, he found Isabel waiting at the gate. She handed him a notebook. "I reorganized your chain of thought structures," she said. "Color-coded, too." He smiled. "A real one. Thank you." She pulled something else from her pocket, a folded piece of paper. "Don't open this until the final round," she said. "I'm serious." "What is it?" "Motivation." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm already motivated," I know she said, "but this one's personal." He tucked it into his coat. When the train pulled out of Cambridge Station, Nathan sat by the window watching the mist rise from the fields and allowed himself just briefly to imagine what it would feel like to win, not for the applause, not for the university, but for every time he had been doubted before he even spoke. He didn't know what would happen in Zurich. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had pushed him to the edge, and now they were going to find out what happens when someone like him stops holding back where he belonged. Zurich greeted Nathan Cole not with fanfare or ceremony, but with silence. A different kind of silence than the one he had grown used to in the lecture halls of Cambridge. This silence was not born of judgment. It was anticipation. The cold morning air swept across the cobblestone streets like a breath held before an answer is revealed. Nathan's steps echoed against the ancient walls of ETH Zurich, the university carved into the mountain with old-world beauty and new-world intellect. As he crossed the courtyard and stepped through the towering doors, Nathan felt something shift, not within the world around him but inside himself. It wasn't nerves. He had trained those out of existence weeks ago. What he felt was something sharper, more refined. It was clarity, like the calm that settles just before a storm arrives, and you know with absolute certainty that you are ready for it. The International Mathematics Invitational was not a place for the faint-hearted. It wasn't a contest of speed or rote memorization. It was designed to fracture confidence. The problems presented were meant to disorient, to invert logic, to make the most brilliant minds second-guess the principles they had built their entire identities around. The competitors came from the world's most elite academic institutions: Stanford, MIT, École Normale Supérieure, Tokyo University. Many were PhD students, postdoctoral researchers, or national Olympiad champions. And then there was Nathan, an undergraduate unknown, unheralded, a student from Cambridge whose name had not appeared in any published journal, whose lineage did not trace back to a legacy of mathematical royalty. His presence at the IMI was to most of them inexplicable, and that alone was enough to draw stares. He could feel them before he even took his seat. The side glances, the smirks. Some tried to hide it behind whispered comments. Others didn't bother. A group of competitors near the front scanned his name tag and chuckled quietly to themselves. One leaned over to his colleague and said, "Cambridge really scraping the bottom of the barrel this year." Nathan heard it. He always heard it. But as usual, he gave no sign. He sat down quietly in the third row, opened his notebook, and began sharpening his pencil. He didn't bring a fancy calculator. He didn't bring a good luck charm. He had brought exactly what he needed: his mind and his preparation. The hall grew quiet as the judges took their seats on stage. Among them, Professor Eleanor Voss sat with her signature impassive expression. She had accepted the invitation to join the IMI's judging panel not because she was interested in overseeing the competition, but because she needed to see it with her own eyes. She needed to know if the student who had forced her to reconsider everything could truly withstand the furnace this stage represented. Sitting 2 seats away from her was Dr. Graham Fletcher, lips pressed into a faint smile, arms folded like a man waiting for a prediction to be fulfilled. Nathan didn't look at either of them. The first round was announced. It would be a 2-hour session of mixed concept problems designed to destabilize competitors by jumping from topology to analysis to combinatorics with no logical sequence. The format was brutal. Each competitor received a set of sealed questions. Once open, the countdown began. Nathan didn't move until the last page was flipped open. His pencil touched the paper with calm authority. Within minutes, the room filled with the sounds of focus, scratchings, rapid erasures, muttered formulas. But Nathan moved differently. Not faster, not louder, just cleaner. Every line he wrote had intent. He didn't backtrack. He didn't second guess. To him, the questions weren't riddles. They were challenges in disguise, begging for simplification. Around him, some students paused, glancing over in disbelief. One MIT competitor whispered to himself, "No way, he's already halfway." Nathan wasn't racing. He was revealing. He finished his first proof 20 minutes before the end of the session and spent the remaining time verifying it in reverse, walking the logic backward with a precision that felt mechanical in its elegance. When time was called, a murmur ran through the competitors, not of victory but of confusion. Many were still stuck halfway through. Others had run out of time entirely. But Nathan closed his booklet with the same quiet confidence he had walked in with. As the pages were collected, Professor Voss leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing for the first time. During the brief break before the second round, Nathan stepped outside alone. He didn't need conversation. He didn't want to hear praise or skepticism. He only wanted the air, the city, the perspective. From the edge of the terrace overlooking the Swiss landscape, he could see the mountains in the distance. They stood timeless and unmoved like the truths he had always trusted in. In math, there were no politics, no bias, no unspoken rules about who should speak and who should remain silent. In math, the only thing that mattered was the answer. The second round began. This time, the focus was on applied logic and nonlinear systems, a notorious combination designed to break apart standard reasoning strategies. The problems were conceptual mazes. Most competitors took 10 minutes just to understand the questions. Nathan began writing after 3, not because he was rushing, but because he had seen the pattern buried beneath the misdirection. He drew diagrams in the margins, testing boundary values, pushing edge cases until the problem revealed its core. There was a moment about 30 minutes into the round when a professor from École Polytechnique leaned over to Voss and whispered, "Who is he?" And Voss, who had spent her career assuming she always knew the answer to that question, said nothing, because in that moment, she wasn't sure anymore. She had taught hundreds of students. She had watched them struggle, succeed, and fail under her ruthless system. But none had ever unnerved her, the way Nathan Cole did not with noise but with silence. He wasn't trying to be extraordinary. He simply was. When the second round ended, Nathan walked back to his seat and took a sip of water. A few rows behind him, two competitors had begun arguing about a problem they hadn't finished. Another slammed his pen down in frustration. Nathan remained untouched by the energy around him. He wasn't competing against them. He was competing against doubt, the doubt of every person who had ever looked at him and expected failure. Then came the final round. It was whispered about for years in the academic community, a set of problems handcrafted by a team of mathematicians whose sole purpose was to test the outer edge of possibility. It was said that the final question had never been solved perfectly within the time limit. Until now, the moderator announced the rules, and the screen flickered to life. One problem, 1 hour, a full page of symbols, integrals, multivariable, transformations, implicit systems, all disguised inside a single narrative of logic. The hall was frozen. Pens didn't move. Eyes scanned the screen in disbelief. And then slowly, Nathan began. But unlike before, he didn't start writing right away. He sat, he stared at the board, and then he smiled. Not arrogantly, not triumphantly. He smiled like someone who had spent years training for this exact moment. His pencil touched the page, and this time he moved quickly, fluidly. Line after line poured out. He didn't pause to reconsider. He didn't hesitate. Each transformation he used felt like it had existed solely for this problem. Each step was tighter than the last. One of the judges stood from his seat and approached the edge of the stage just to watch more closely. Fletcher leaned forward, frowning. Voss stared at the screen, her knuckles white against the armrest. The final minutes ticked away. Nathan was the first to finish. He put down his pencil and leaned back in his chair, exhaling softly. He didn't look around. He didn't need validation. He knew. When the timer sounded, papers were collected, and silence filled the room once more. It wasn't just quiet. It was stunned. The judges disappeared into a private room to review the answers. The rest of the hall remained seated too dazed to talk. After 20 minutes, the head judge returned to the stage. He cleared his throat and looked down at the notes in his hand. One competitor not only solved all rounds correctly, but also delivered a more elegant and efficient solution to the final problem than any we have seen in the history of this competition. He paused. Nathan Cole, Cambridge University. A single clap broke the silence, then another. And then the hall erupted, not with politeness, but with genuine awe. Competitors stood. Professors nodded. Some simply stared. But Nathan remained seated, because the victory had never been about applause. It had always been about truth. Professor Voss remained still, then slowly stood and approached him after the announcement. For a moment, she said nothing. Then finally, "You didn't prove me wrong. You proved the limits of what I thought was possible." He nodded. "That was never my goal," he said. "I just stopped believing in your limits." And with that, Nathan Cole left the stage not as the underdog, but as the new standard. The morning Nathan Cole returned to Cambridge, the sky above the university was gray, but the world beneath it had shifted. News of his win at the International Mathematics Invitational had crossed oceans in less than 24 hours. Academic circles whispered his name with a blend of wonder and disbelief. Articles were already circulating. An undergraduate with no publications, no mentorship from elite faculty, had outperformed the best doctoral minds from the most prestigious institutions on Earth. But inside the corridors of Cambridge, no trumpets sounded. There were no posters, no congratulatory banners hanging from the arches of the mathematics building. The silence remained familiar but not empty this time. It wasn't the silence of disregard. It was the silence of reckoning. Every hallway Nathan walked now carried a subtle hum, a shift in posture from those who used to glance past him. Some nodded at him respectfully. Others looked away, but few looked through him anymore. When he entered Professor Eleanor Voss's lecture hall for the first class after Zurich, the usual tension returned, but it had changed shape. He took his usual seat in the middle of the room. Same hoodie, same notebook, same sharpened pencil resting beside a blank page. Around him, classmates hesitated to speak. They exchanged glances, half curious, half reverent. Then Voss entered. As always, she didn't speak at first. She placed her binder on the lectern, removed her coat, and adjusted her glasses. Then, just as the room settled into its ritual stillness, she did something none of them expected. She turned to face the students, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk. "Before we begin today's lecture," she said, her voice sharp and level, "I have a correction to make, a personal one." A rustle of unease moved through the rows. She glanced at Nathan. "Mr. Cole has reminded this institution and myself that we are not always the best judges of genius. Sometimes brilliance doesn't arrive with a recommendation letter or a polished resume. Sometimes it walks in quietly, sits in the third row, and rewrites every assumption you thought you understood." No one moved. No one spoke. "I judged him," she continued, "not on the merit of his ideas, but on the shape of his silence. And I was wrong." The words fell like stones into a still pond. There was no applause, no dramatic swell of music. But in that moment, something unspoken cracked open across the room. Nathan didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded once and turned his gaze to the board. Later that week, in a faculty roundtable discussing mathematics education and equity, Voss sat in front of a panel of colleagues and academics who had long seen her as a fortress of tradition. She listened to a discussion about pipeline development and diversity initiatives and the lack of representation in advanced theoretical programs. And then she said, "I used to think fairness was about opportunity, but I've come to understand it's also about access to belief. When we don't expect greatness from someone, we build systems to prevent them from proving us wrong. And when someone like Nathan Cole walks into that system and succeeds anyway, the system needs to change, not the student." Her voice was calm, but her eyes were fire. In the weeks that followed, the Department of Pure Mathematics quietly initiated a review of its admission screening process. For the first time in decades, a student advisory board was formed to include voices from diverse academic and social backgrounds. A mentorship initiative was launched, voluntary, non-performative, grounded in mutual exploration rather than control. None of these things bore Nathan's name, but they bore his shadow. Outside of Cambridge, offers began to flood in: summer fellowships, conference, invitations, speaking engagements. An Ivy League dean reached out to ask if he might consider a research collaboration. The head of a European think tank invited him to join a closed project in quantum logic. Even companies usually silent in the world of theoretical math began contacting the university's registrar to get a meeting with the Zurich winner. But Nathan said no to all of it. He wasn't interested in becoming someone else's trophy. He didn't need the validation anymore. One evening, weeks after his return, Nathan met Isabel Tran by the River Cam. The sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across the water. They sat on the stone ledge in silence, watching the current move. She finally turned to him. "You really did it." He didn't answer immediately. Maybe he said, "But I'm still not sure what it is." "You proved them wrong," she replied. "I didn't do it to prove them wrong." "Then why?" He looked out across the river. "I did it so the next person wouldn't have to." Isabel pulled out a small envelope and handed it to him. It was the one she'd given him before he left for Zurich, the one he never opened. Inside was a single line scrawled in her tidy handwriting. "You don't have to shout to be heard. Just make sure the silence left behind echoes." He folded the note, not saying a word. She rested her head lightly on his shoulder. That night, Nathan went back to his room and began mapping out the blueprint for something he'd thought about for months. A platform, not a resume builder, not a recruitment tool, a place to teach math the way it had taught him as a refuge, not a test. He called it Proof Simple, Clean, Elegant. It would be free, no logins, no applications, no metrics of pedigree, just access to ideas and challenges from elementary logic to doctoral level systems built with humility and integrity. He uploaded his own problem sets, annotated with thought process explanations. No solutions, just pathways, no grades, just growth. Within 3 weeks, the platform had over 1,000 users. Within 6 months, it had students logging in from high schools in Detroit, Accra, Mumbai, East London, and rural villages in the Philippines. He added one more page to the site, a blank field titled Submit Your Own Problem. He wanted to learn from them too. Meanwhile, Dr. Graham Fletcher submitted his resignation from the admissions committee. His reasons were personal, but those close to him understood something had cracked. He wasn't built to stay in a system where students like Nathan were no longer exceptions to be dissected, but truths to be respected. Years later, Fletcher would admit in a closed-door seminar, "My error wasn't in underestimating Nathan Cole, it was in overestimating the machine I'd helped build." Voss stayed. But she changed, not in dramatic ways. She still walked briskly, still demanded rigor, still wore the same silver-rimmed glasses. But her classroom changed. She stopped using fear as fuel. She started asking more questions. She invited challenges. And when a student hesitated to speak up, she'd often say, "If you see something different, say it. That's how we build new maps." Nathan remained at Cambridge until the end of his undergraduate years, declining early doctoral invitations. He spent his time exactly the way he had always intended, exploring problems no one had dared to frame before and helping students who had been told directly or indirectly that they didn't belong. One afternoon, after a student approached him in the library and nervously asked for help on a nonlinear system problem, Nathan looked up and said, "You don't need my permission to be good at this. Let's just figure it out together." That student would later go on to win a national prize in applied logic. Nathan never mentioned it to anyone because he never needed the credit. One quiet Friday morning, months before his graduation, he returned to the lecture hall where it had all started. The same room, the same middle row seat, the same light. He sat for a moment in silence, then opened his notebook and began writing a new problem. Not for himself, for someone who would sit there someday alone, overlooked, underestimated, but ready. The chalkboard remained blank that day, but the silence left behind, it wasn't empty. It was waiting to echo. Nathan Cole was never supposed to be the face of brilliance, not according to the system, not according to the algorithms of expectation, not according to the academic gatekeepers who believed genius came with a pedigree and spoke in the accents of privilege. But that is precisely what made his story unforgettable. He didn't arrive at Cambridge with accolades or headlines. He arrived with silence, and that silence became the most revolutionary part of who he was. He didn't argue for his place. He didn't campaign to be seen. He simply did the work. In a world built to overlook him, Nathan's greatest act of defiance wasn't loud or public. It was mathematical. It was exact, elegant, undeniable. From the moment he pointed out Professor Eleanor Voss's mistake in that cold, watchful lecture hall, something fundamental cracked, not just in the room, but in the very foundation of what people assumed brilliance looked like. He wasn't meant to challenge her. He wasn't meant to rewrite a mistake that had gone unnoticed by a room full of experts, and yet he did not out of arrogance, but out of principle. From there, the trials only grew steeper. The problems are harder, the scrutiny is sharper, the prejudice is louder. But Nathan never once asked for it to be easier. Instead, he trained harder, thought deeper, built endurance not just for equations, but for the judgment that would inevitably come with answering them. He turned the university library into his second home. He treated his preparation for the International Mathematics Invitational not like a competition, but like a mission. When others looked at the IMI as a stage to prove themselves, Nathan treated it as a stage to prove a system wrong, not by tearing it down, but by outperforming it, by excelling within the very architecture that was never built for him. In Zurich, against the most elite minds from MIT, Stanford, Princeton, and Europe's finest institutions, Nathan didn't just compete, he surpassed. With elegance, with grace, with a aim that unnerved even the most seasoned professors. And when his name was called, not a single person could deny what they had seen. Nathan Cole hadn't just solved math problems, he had rewritten the invisible equation of what academic worthiness looks like. He returned to Cambridge not with fanfare, but with change in his wake. Professor Voss, once the symbol of rigid hierarchy and elitist rigor, stood before her class and admitted the truth: she had misjudged him. She had underestimated what genius looks like when it comes wrapped in silence and skin that doesn't fit the mold. That moment, though brief, was monumental because it signaled a fracture in something much larger. In the weeks and months that followed, the ripple effect was undeniable. Conversations changed, policies shifted, doors began to open for those who like. Nathan had always had the mind but never the microphone. But Nathan didn't linger in the spotlight. He built something better. He created proof, a platform not for accolades, but for access. A space for students around the world who had been told they weren't ready, weren't enough, or simply didn't belong. A place where the only thing that mattered was your curiosity and your will to learn. No gatekeeping, no prerequisites, just math and belief. That may have been his greatest act of genius, not the problems he solved, but the barriers he broke for others. Because in the end, Nathan Cole did not want to be celebrated. He wanted to be the last person who had to fight that hard just to be seen. And in that way, his story becomes more than a victory tale. It becomes a blueprint, the lesson redefining genius and rebuilding the system. So what can we take away from Nathan's story? Is it just about one brilliant student who shocked the world? No, it's much more than that. Nathan's journey reminds us of something deeply uncomfortable, that many of our institutions are not built to recognize genius. They're built to recognize familiarity. They're built to affirm those who already belong. But Nathan Cole shattered that illusion. He proved that excellence doesn't ask for permission, that preparation, resilience, and clarity of mind can outmatch pedigree, connections, and assumptions. His story teaches us that real genius doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it waits in silence, ignored, underestimated, almost invisible, until it can no longer be denied. And that's the exact lesson we need today. In workplaces, in schools, and society, we must unlearn the bias that equates visibility with value. We must stop asking, "Does this person fit the part?" and start asking, "Can we see the truth beneath the surface?" We must stop mistaking conformity for competence. And perhaps most of all, we must stop assuming who is worthy of opportunity and start building systems that let excellence rise without being filtered by appearance, accent, background, or origin. Because Nathan didn't win because someone gave him a chance. He won because he took it even when it was rigged against him. And if we're being honest, how many potential Nathans are still out there? How many minds are sitting in the back rows of classrooms right now, hiding brilliance behind fear? How many doors are still closed to them? That's the work left for all of us. To build systems that don't just recognize excellence after the fact, but nurture it from the beginning, to ask better questions, to listen harder, to look twice. If you were in Professor Voss's position facing a student who challenges everything you've been taught to believe about who belongs, what would you do? A. Defend your authority and stay in control. B. Acknowledge your bias and be open to change. Comment your answer below, A or B, and tell us why. We want to hear your honest thoughts. What would it take to let go of ego and embrace truth, even when it's uncomfortable? Let's talk about it in the comments. Now it's your voice we want to hear. Do you believe our academic and professional systems are truly fair? Have you ever felt like Nathan, like you had to work twice as hard just to be seen? Or have you witnessed someone else go through that? Share your perspective in the comments. Let others learn from your story. The more we speak up, the more we help each other. We also invite you to subscribe to this channel if this story moved you. Every subscription helps us create more powerful content that brings light to the stories that are too often ignored. And if you'd like to support us even further, consider donating to the channel. We're just starting out, and every contribution, no matter how small, helps us cover production costs, licensing, and research so we can continue telling stories like Nathan's with the care depth and quality they deserve. You can find the donation link in the video description. Thank you for being here, for listening, for thinking deeper. This isn't just a story. It's a reminder that somewhere out there, someone is quietly rewriting the future. Let's make sure we're listening.